Who are some of the most logical choices at number 14? Who are some of the best toys that will be available for Howie Roseman and Joe Douglas? Turron Davenport, USA Today Eagles Wire, has some always strong opinions, and he joins us now on the Sports Bash 97.3 ESPN as we are 8 days away from the draft, Turron, and I'm sure you are formulating more of an opinion on which way the Eagles front office should go.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's multiple directions they could go. It's really going to depend on who's available and what direction they want to take. Do they want to address offense or defense? And, I mean, there's a lot that could happen. So I'm looking forward to seeing how it all pans out.
All right, let's ask this then. At 14, you've got your favorite wide receiver, your favorite running back, and the best corner. Which way should Howie Roseman go in that scenario?
Well, out of those three, I would probably address the cornerback position, go with the best corner, and that would, at this point, be Marshawn Lattimore. And if he's there at 14, they should have no hesitation turning in the card and taking Lattimore. That addresses a need, and I think that's a good situation for them because there you have the best player available matching needs. So I think that's a good option, and that would be the ideal first round for the Eagles.
All right, now let's take Lattimore off the board. Same scenario. You got your favorite running back, your favorite wide receiver, and maybe two or three corners are now off the board. Does that change things?
Yeah, I still wouldn't address the corner position, from that perspective. I think Dalvin Cook really has to be in play. Mike Williams is intriguing as well as John Ross. I would probably put John Ross as a better fit than Mike Williams at this point. But, looking at that, I would probably go for Dalvin Cook. I just think the home run ability that he brings, just the fact that he's one of those guys that doesn't need 25 to 30 carries to be effective. You could get a lot of 17-carry games in which he gets 90 to 100 yards and a touchdown and has some impact receiving as well. So I think he's the best fit. You look at what they did at Florida State, a lot of those zone concepts were there in which they gave him the opportunity to use his vision and footwork, which is in a combination that's rare as far as looking at these other backs. And, his ability to see the hole and have his footwork in control to cut back and have the acceleration to, pull away once he gets to the second level. I think that's ideal, especially looking at what teams are going to do against the Eagles, because they're going to continue to be a team that passes the ball predominantly. So now you're going to see more defenses in which, he'll have those rushing lanes to run because they're going to be so focused on stopping the passing game.
Turron Davenport's with us. So, by the way, you like Cook over, say, a McCaffrey. Seems like a lot of people are going McCaffrey. They're starting to like him more and more. He's going up draft boards, more of a, dual threat, almost triple threat when you throw his returning abilities in there. Cook also has some off-the-field, issues. So you like still Cook better?
Yeah, I like Cook, and I think, especially for Philadelphia, I mean, they have a good system in place. Howie Roseman has said it multiple times. Big Dom does a really good job of digging deep and getting the background on these players. So if they were in a position to take Cook and they take him, that would tell me that they're comfortable with all of the research that they've done. Obviously, there are some things, that would be a cause for concern. But if you look at a lot of people that have met Cook and spent time with Cook, they actually came away saying he's a much better person than they thought he was. So, I mean, it's really all about perception. Who knows how everything will check out. But I think if the Eagles were to take him, that would be a sign that, they really are confident. And you figure, here's the thing, they've met with him 3 or 4 times,
right.
And Deuce Staley worked him out personally. And we already saw last year how Deuce with Smallwood, he could have some impact there because that Wendell Smallwood pick was, something that really developed out of the relationship that he and Deuce Staley had. So if you look at it, Cook, he's my number one back. Obviously, McCaffrey is a guy that a lot of people are impressed with, but at the same time, that return ability that he has, if you draft him at 14, I don't really think you're going to use him as much as a returner. So now you're pulling away one of his 3 greatest attributes. So it's hard to really pick up and maximize the value that he will bring for the Eagles, with that higher pick, because you don't want your guy doing all of those things, back there returning kicks and returning punts if you use the number 14 overall pick on him.
Yeah, and I hear a lot of comparisons to, say, Brian Westbrook with him. You know, he catches the ball. Westbrook caught a lot of passes in this particular Andy Reid style of offense. Remember, though, Brian Westbrook was drafted in the 3rd round, not at number 14 overall. So just kind of keep that into consideration. We're talking with Turron Davenport, USA Today, Eagles Wire. With what they did in free agency at wideout, has that kind of removed the wideouts from 14 for you?
No, that hasn't removed it for me. I mean, like I said, I think John Ross is a guy that definitely should be in play. I mean, Torrey Smith is a really good player. I think he still has potential to stretch the field, and we'll see what happens with Alshon Jeffrey, as far as after this year. But the fact still remains they don't have that speed on the roster, outside of Torrey. So you get a guy like John Ross who will completely stretch the field. He's a guy you can play in the slot if you want, but more importantly, the jet sweep is something. You get that 4-2-2, you let him turn that corner, he's gone, and that's 6 points. So there's a lot that you could do with him as well.
You wrote about John, and he also talked about some of his teammates. There's a lot of talent on that Washington team. One of the reasons why they made it to the Final Four there. What are some of the things you learned by picking his brain on this draft class?
Well, I mean, I didn't talk to Ross personally. That was a tweet that he had put out from when he was with NFL Network. Mm-hmm. But I could tell you, from having watched Washington a lot and having seen them live, there's a lot to like on that team. I mean, Elijah Qualls is a guy on that defensive line, a D tackle that could play. Buda Baker, so many people sleep on his ability. If you remember a couple years ago, a guy named Jimmy Ward went to the 49ers in the 1st round, and they used him initially as their nickel back, and then, they used him at safety as well. I see a lot of similarities between the two, and that he's someone that could play corner, in a nickel situation for you and come up, come down in the box and cover your slot receivers, but he could also be a safety for you as well, and special teams. So Buda Baker is a guy that's being slept on, but I'll tell you, a lot of teams like him. Obviously, Sidney Jones, who's been my number 1 corner. Kevin King is someone that people, started to come around on after the combine. But as far as ball skills and length and physicality, he definitely has it. Just, his long arms, he can use them to disrupt the receivers at the line of scrimmage. So that's something you want. So that team is really solid. And then on the other side, you have Dante Pettis, who's, his father, Gary Pettis, was a baseball player. And, he has a brother who also played in the league as well. So, you got bloodlines there. And Pettis, actually the game that I saw against Arizona State, he had a really good game. And he's a guy that could have an impact, on the outside. If you watch Washington, he wore number 8 for them. And he's a really good receiver also. Speed guy, 4.4, 4.3 range, decent size. So there's a lot of talent on that team.
Turron, you and I both like Sidney Jones a lot. I was very devastated to see that he went down, not just for the Eagles, but just for the kid who seemed like he was going to be an impact player. One, when do you think the teams will start thinking about him? And number 2, on his teammate Kevin King, what is too high for Kevin King? Because I've seen some mock drafts having the Eagles take him at 14.
Yeah, I mean, that's really going to, again, depend on how the board falls, who goes. You could have, teams, instead of taking quarterbacks or instead of, going for, one of the other guys, they could take some corners, and you could be stuck in a situation where he's the best player that matches need. And, he's right there along the lines of some of the other prospects. So I think 14 is a legitimate option for Kevin King. Some people will say that that's high, but when you look at what he brings to the table, I mean, you can't coach that length. You can't coach that quickness. You can't coach that athleticism. So there's a lot to work with there. And with how the Eagles do things as far as, putting their guys on the island, I think that he brings it. And then you have future value as well, because he is a former safety. So you could move him back to safety, which is what he played, a couple years at Washington. So you could extend his career that way also. So Kevin King, I mean, he's someone I would look at. But Sidney Jones, I think at 43, I think that that's valid to look at that. The guy, he had his cast removed, and he's starting to get some movement. Some of his range of movement. That's what he said on the article he wrote for the Players Tribune. So I think that he'll be back at some point. And, I mean, it's not like the Eagles want to win the Super Bowl this year. So if you could pocket a guy like that who prior to the injury was the top cornerback in my book, I think you're making a pretty good investment. And Howie Roseman has talked about long term, and that's what you're doing if you get a guy like Sidney Jones.
What's your take on Conley, who, some people now are starting to even say that, he should have been creeping up a little higher than 14, and comparing him to his teammate Lattimore there?
Yeah, because you're seeing the visits to Jacksonville. I think he had a visit with the Jets, too. A lot of people forget that last year, not last year, but 2015, the starters were Eli Apple and Gary and Conley. Marshawn Lattimore was not starting ahead of him. Conley's a former receiver from Ohio. He actually went to the same school as Davenport Smith, who was drafted by the Jets. They were in the same receiver unit. So you have the understanding of how receivers like to run routes, understanding of, what receivers don't like corners to do. So that's an advantage for him. He's long. He'll turn the football over for you. He does a really good job of recognizing routes. So that's there. I think Conley is solid. To me, I wouldn't take him at 14. I don't see that big separation between him and, Trey Davis-White, that group of guys. I even think Akello Weatherspoon, a guy who was here in Philly visiting with the Eagles last week, who said the visit went very well, by the way. I think he's someone that is right there in that same stratosphere, as well as Chidobe Awuzie. So there's numerous guys. Kevin King, we talked about him too. So there's a group of guys that I don't think that the huge separation is there between Conley and them.
All right, number 14, Eagles, and we know with Howie Roseman in the room, there's always a possibility of a move up, down, sideways, all around when they hit the board. And Turron Davenport over at USA Today, the Eagles Wire. Check that out as the NFL Draft gets closer, and we'll see if anything shakes up between now and then with this field. It's a lot more tight-lipped, it seems like, than in years past.
Yeah, it has been very tight-lipped. I have heard, not from Eagles sources, but some of the other sources throughout the league, that it's going to be a pretty active first round. So we'll see. I think number 10 is a sweet spot for the Eagles. I really want to see what happens with this Malcolm Butler situation. And I'm not saying the Eagles will trade for him. What I am saying is that could impact what the Eagles do, because you have the Saints sitting at 11, who very well could draft a corner if they're not able to acquire Malcolm Butler. So now the number 10 pick, Buffalo's pick, comes into play. I know Buffalo, they like Mike Williams, who I think will be there for them at number 14. If they were to swap picks with the Eagles, it would probably take a fourth-round pick. They have two of those, so you could combine those two and move up. You could even, let's say, you want to put a guy like a Michael Kendricks and the 14 pick together to move up to 10. That's feasible. So I think 10 is a spot where they can move up to, and that's where you're looking at getting Lattimore, if he should fall past the Titans and the Jets, who just signed, a man from the Cowboys. Name slips my mind, from LSU. Wow, it slipped my mind. But they just signed the Cowboys, Mo Claiborne. They just signed him.
Right.
So now, corner could be in play. It may not. I mean, we'll see what happens. Fournette is another guy that could be in play. So there's so many different directions that the draft could go, which would allow Conley to be there at 10. And I think the Eagles should definitely jump up if he is there at 10.
At @Davenport_NFL, read his piece on Carson Wentz and Alshon Jeffrey, Brandon Graham on Vinny Curry. Really good stuff from Turron as we get ready on both the current roster and who could be added to the roster. Turron, always enjoy it, pal. Take care.
Definitely. Thanks a lot.